Welcome to Forsaken by Shadows, a production of stories by Sarah Danielle. And as of 1 hour before this recording, I now have a Ko-Fi, or coffee, or however it's supposed to be said. Anyway, recently I've had a few people reach out and express interest in supporting me financially, which honestly, completely baffles me. But if that is something you'd be interested in doing, I've set up my Ko-fi, coffee, whatever, which I will link in the show notes. Because of the nature of the type of fiction Forsaken by Shadows is, I can never put a paywall in front of it to make people pay to read or listen to it, nor would I actually want to. But I can collect donations through websites like Patreon and Ko-Fi, as well as ad revenue if I ever reach enough relevant status on places like YouTube. So rest assured, you will never have to pay for Forsaken by Shadows. And like I said, I would never want you to. However, if you do wish to support me through donations, I humbly thank you and promise to do my best to be worthy of your gratitude. I have a lot of plans for things I would like to provide for my Ko-Fi supporters, but the creation of such content takes time and effort, which are, unfortunately, a limited resource. For now, I'm focusing on writing Forsaken by Shadows, while dabbling in the possibilities of releasing it as a free ebook. Since the very beginning of this project, I expected it to only be a pursuit of passion, not financial gain. So as much as donations would be appreciated, what I really crave is your feedback. I get a lot of views and downloads, but very few comments on the work, so it makes it hard to know the true reach of this story. So if you are listening or reading along, and you've never said hi before, consider taking a moment to drop me a note. Whether you are on Discord, Instagram, YouTube, Substack, Threads, Wattpad, or another podcast platform, I'd love to hear from my listeners and get to know who you are. And if you've already left me a note, thank you. I guarantee you I've read them all, memorized many of them, and go back to them when the days are hard to remind myself that writing this story really is worth it. Okay, whew. Now that that's all out of the way, let's get on with what has quickly become one of my favorite chapters. Previously, on Forsaken by Shadows, from Tiana's point of view. Today was the first day of Mazira's sword dance training, and I could not have been more excited. I could hardly believe it when she told Father and I at breakfast that she had been invited to ascend to the Order of Songblades by Mother Lara, and that she had purchased a sword and had even been secretly training with Risman for the last 6 cycles. I had wondered where the two of them had been sneaking off to together. I thought they just finally started kissing. But this is by far the next best thing. Mazira stepping out in faith and facing her fears. I am, as the surface dwellers say, over the moon to be a part of this. Of course, the closer we get to the class, the paler Mazira gets. I can see she is second-guessing her choices, and I refuse to let her back down because she's afraid. So I stay by her side until the teachers arrive, and I pass her off to Mistress Alinea. Even while I participate in the class myself, I watch Mazira and Alinea pace the classroom. I know what she's going through, somewhat. The same orientation I went to when I was 12 and deemed old enough to learn. Alinea is explaining why we do what we do, and likely asking Mazira questions about Elistrea. It's important to make sure song dance students understand who it is we are dancing for. If they just want to learn to sword fight, well, they can go to the militia for that. And as if the joy of the day couldn't get better, as we wind down our practice, 2 of the Songblades leave and return with a chest of clothing, festival costumes we can borrow if we like. Now, festival garments are not like ordinary garments. I know they're supposed to be sacred and for ceremony, but I, and my friends, well, we can't help but get a little excited. They're fun. Bright colors and small cuts. We get to revel in the beauty of ourselves and I completely forgot about Mazira's scars. When she comes to see what all the fuss is about, I don't even think about it when I choose something for her I think would suit her. Her look of horror reminds me why I make all her dresses with high collars. I promise her that I can make her something else, something festive that still covers her markings, but Mazira turns away from me. She goes back to the box, staring at the costumes. And then she asks me something I would never have dreamed she would ask me for. A dress my father wouldn't approve of. Of course, When it comes to festival wear, the rules are much more relaxed, but I understand what she's trying to say. I'm certain she will change her mind, but she remains steady and resolved. So I agree, and we decide to go home, because something about this event has inspired Mizira to choose her ordeal, her testing of her faith before she can become a clergy. Forsaken by Shadows, Part 3. Where Shadows Linger. Chapter 20. Friends in Weird Places. Risman. Since the arrival of Bregan de Arth, Risman had stopped going home for the mid-cycle meal, instead choosing to spend the hour between blue light rounds and his white light responsibilities on the Riverwalk. Belnir had said their presence there would make a difference in how well the outsiders behaved, and Risman took that mission seriously. Which was the only reason behind his newfound penchant for eating out with the Risers, now that they had rotated off market patrol. Certainly not because of a particular sun elf who had begun to frequent Solaran's home during the same hour, hanging on to Mizira's every word and having an infuriating habit of making her laugh. No, that had nothing to do with it. He wasn't that petty. He was just going to the docks to make sure Drader didn't do, well, Drader things. Though in the 4 cycles that had elapsed since that fateful run-in, he had yet to see his old acquaintance again. Yet as fate would have it, he had no choice but to go home on this particular cycle. It was either that or show up on the docks with half of his right sleeve torn off. He'd been sparring with Arden, who seemed to be losing all grasp of the concept of restraint as the cycles ticked away. Had their singing swords not been magically blunted, Risman might have lost more than just his sleeve. But Risman didn't hold the damage against Arden. Like the other Risers, he considered it a cruel test of his patience to deny a son every opportunity to contribute in meaningful ways to the search for his father. A sentiment he couldn't have fathomed a year ago, when the word family had been the equivalent of a curse. But if Mizira were out there, or Tiana, or even Solaran, Risman wasn't convinced he wouldn't have torn down Lana's walls stone by stone. Arden had already been caught twice trying to sneak out of the wall, and each time he was sent home he became surlier and surlier. If venting his anger in a friendly spar meant sparing someone else the wrath, Risman supposed he could sacrifice his shirt, and the full range of motion in his right shoulder. Risman massaged his muscles, debating on whether or not to beg a healing song off Mizira. Not that she would make him beg. She sang for him as freely now as she had when they were children. No, more freely. Back then, she'd had no choice. No, he wouldn't ask her to sing for his own comfort. Never again. His shoulder wasn't broken. He didn't need magical healing. It would get better on its own in a few cycles. If Mizira noticed and offered, that would be a different story. His muscles throbbed again, and Risman grimaced, determined not to waver in his conviction. A little pain was good for him. He couldn't get used to instant relief. At least, that's what he told himself as he approached the front door of the Weaver's house. Grasping the latch, Risman made to shove inward, but found the solid jerkwood door unwilling to relent, resulting in his good shoulder thudding into the barrier. Locked. At this hour? Risman glanced up, confirming the light was indeed pure white. Someone should have been home by now. He couldn't recall anything special planned for this particular cycle. Except Mizira's first attempt at sword dancing class. Of course! How could he have forgotten that? He'd been the one to encourage her to go. Okay, that accounted for Mizira, and Tiana would be with her as well. That nuisance of a sun elf would probably be skulking around the temple courtyard waiting for Mizira to emerge, a thought which sent tremors of acidic jealousy through Risman's core. Not that there was anything he could do about it. The alternative was waiting with Valen, and that was far less appealing. Still, there should have at least been apprentices inside, even if Solaran had stepped away. The priest had been spending more and more hours out of the house during these dark times, as the Whispers were calling it, returning home haggard and worn. Yet though his burdens carried him back and forth to the temple and the docks, Solarin wouldn't allow the production of his business to slip. He was hardly likely to dismiss his workers early. Well, regardless of where everyone was, Risman still faced a locked door, which wasn't going to grow any more yielding just by staring at it. He reached into his belt pouch, fishing for the key, then froze. Something more was wrong here. He couldn't say why, whether it was a sound his subconscious had registered or shifting in the air, but danger prickled like static over his skin, some deep ingrained instinct warning him that he was no longer alone. Grabbing his dagger instead of the key, he whirled around to face the unknown threat. Nothing. Scowling, Risman took a few steps into the courtyard, scanning the street for any sign of life and sighing when there was none. Great. Now he was losing his mind. Sheathing his blade, he spun back to the door and uttered a particularly colorful oath. Drader sat on the stoop of the house, not 3 feet behind where Risman stood, resting his cheek against his good fist and looking bored out of his mind. "My gods, you're jumpy," he said. "Isn't this city supposed to be safe?" Risman's hand darted to the hilt of his dagger, though he didn't draw it yet. "What the hell are you doing here?" he demanded, struggling to keep his voice down and avoid the notice of the neighbors. The corner of Drader's mouth quirked upward, which drew attention to a scabbed-over cut splitting the middle of his lower lip. "What? I can't come visit an old friend?" "Literally no, you cannot," Risman said. "What part of Bragenday is forbidden from venturing past Dock Road do you not understand?" Drader gave a scornful laugh, leaning back on his hand and hook. "Rules? You must be joking." Clenching his jaw, Risman forced his fingers away from his dagger and crossed his arms. He briefly had an image of Solarin standing in a similar way, preparing to lecture him on some wrongdoing or another, but he dismissed it. He wasn't turning into Solarin, and he wasn't going to waste his breath on lecturing Drader. But he was somewhat representative of the law, even if only unofficially. "Do any of your other friends take similar liberties with the rules?" he asked. "They're not my friends," Drader shrugged. "And I wouldn't know. Been out in the wilds for the last few days kicking up stones. Just rotated off this morning and thought I'd go for a walk. Do you know, people will just tell you anything in this city. I asked where to find you and got directions straight here. Must not have recognized me for what I am without the armor." It was only then that Risman looked at him. Really looked at him. Drader was indeed dressed in casual clothes, a smoke-covered silk shirt under a black brocade vest. Aside from a single blade hanging off his belt, he didn't appear to be armed or armored whatsoever. The sight was unsettling, almost relaxed, and it didn't fit the picture Risman had of his old rival. Neither did the remains of a blackened eye that marred his face. The broken blood beneath his skin faded to a sickly yellowish tinge on his otherwise obsidian complexion. Violence suited Drader, but he was usually the one doling it out, not receiving it. His appearance, combined with the information he had just divulged, knocked Risman off kilter. While some part of him still wanted to fume, still wanted to be irate that someone had willingly surrendered his home location to a drow Risman had just threatened to murder a few cycles ago, he couldn't help his curiosity. Drader had been in the wilds. He'd been working the job every militia member and beyond was dying to volunteer for. Arden wasn't the only one who was twitching to do something about Torafane and Chrysla. Temporarily setting aside his hate, Risman asked a cautious, "Did you find anything out there?" "Not a damn thing," Drader said, kicking out his feet and crossing his ankles. "Your mystery murderers remain a mystery. Ah well, more gold for us the longer we stay." Disappointment swelled inside of Risman, bleeding into irritation and suspicion. More gold if they stayed? Who was to say the mercs wouldn't milk their sorrows for all they were worth? Nothing, Risman said, accusation scalding his tongue. Then what happened to your face? Trip over one of those stones you were kicking up? What, this? Drader gestured to his split lip with his hook. Yeah, right. This was my reward for harassing the locals. His tone took on a bitter cast. You know, from when I came over to say hi at the tavern. Didn't you get anything for it? Whatever answer Risman had been expecting, it hadn't been that. He blinked, somewhat taken aback, and studied Drader's injuries again. They were faded, not fresh, quite possibly 4 cycles old. But were they really because of him? He considered his memory of the encounter, of Salaran and Kalos intervening. What was it Kalos had said? I'll take care of mine if you take care of yours. Icy fingers clawed their way down Risman's spine. Had he been away from Menzo Barons so long that he'd forgotten how discipline was dealt out? Drow only spoke one language, the voice of betrayal and pain. Quite suddenly, without his permission, his perception of Drader shifted. He no longer looked at the mercenary with contempt and irritation, but pity. A perspective which made his stomach churn. He didn't want to feel anything for Drader, let alone something resembling the ghost of compassion. I got a lecture, he finally said, if he could even call his discussion with Salaran a lecture, about holding my temper. Drader blinked, cocking his head to the side. A lecture? Yeah. Like, with words? Yeah. Drader was silent for a moment, before bursting out with laughter, sitting up and hunching over. Seriously? Wow! They said you were a bunch of soft tender bats out here, but I didn't realize how bad it was. Did you sing songs about your feelings afterwards too? So much for compassion. Risman's temper seared and his fingers twitched to make a fist. But once more an image of Salaran's disappointed expression flashed through his mind, and instead of giving Drader a second black eye, he put his hands to his hips and waited until his laughter died away. It would be a mistake to confuse restraint with weakness, Risman said, when Drader finally regained control of his mirth. Yeah, sure, Drader said, wiping a tear from his eye. That's why your fancy queen matron is paying us to chase your ghosts for you. Reverend Mother, Risman corrected through his teeth. Get out of here, Drader. Go back to your friends, and I won't report you to command. Drader's eyes narrowed. I told you, they're not my friends, he said. And what do I care if you report me? The worst I'll get is a lecture, right? Risman's energy for this conversation was rapidly draining away. He withheld a dramatic and Salaran-esque sigh, his eyes rolling toward the cavern ceiling. What do you want anyway? I told you, I'm visiting an old friend. Risman was just about to retort when Drader's words struck him. He had twice now denied the mercenaries he'd arrived with as friends, yet, twice now, and even at the tavern, he had called Risman a friend. Risman had assumed he used the term mockingly, but what if he hadn't? What if friend actually meant something to Drader? If that were true, his perception of the word was definitely skewed. I'm not your friend, Risman said. You hate me, remember? Hate you? Drader repeated. I don't hate you. I did briefly after, you know. He waved his hook emphatically. But I got over it. Actually, it turned out for the better. I'm living like a king compared to my life in House Tiglath. The worst part was, Risman actually believed him, black eye, split lip, and all. Not about liking him. Risman didn't think Drader had the capacity to like anyone, but about his life among the mercenaries being better than living at home. Kalos had promised Risman freedom and gold, and really, what else could a drow want when they had no idea life could be so much better than that? Drader was a portrait of what Risman could have been, and he didn't like what he saw. "You tried to kill me," Risman reminded him. "So?" Drader laughed again. "Aw, come on, Riz. You're always so sensitive about everything. No wonder you turned out to be a deviant." Risman just stared at him, expression flat, and to his immense surprise, Drader actually looked away first. "You really ought to let it go," he said. "It's not like it was personal. You taunted me every day of our life in the pyramid. You tormented Mazira just to provoke me. You nearly got her killed by Gylus, and you announced to the whole class that I was a deviant, effectively slaughtering my reputation if I had tried to stay." "Yeah, and?" Risman tossed up his hands. "How is that not personal?" "Simple," Drader said. "It was strategy." "What?" "Think about it." Drader leaned forward, resting his arms on his knees. "I was top of the class. You were, what, 8th place?" "6th," Risman corrected. There was no way Drader had forgotten. Risman had stood right behind him in formation for over a year. "Right, sure. But that was just in class. Outside of class, in the rest of the world, you were the highest ranked student in our year, the second son of the 5th house, and your brother was already a legend." Oh no, he was starting to make sense. "It would have been stupid of me not to ruin you while I had the chance, before you had time to come into your own abilities. Cripple your matron mother, set back her plans for you and her house, make her look weak so perhaps another house would seize the opportunity to destroy House Tyr, and we in Tiglath could move higher up without actually having to raise a blade. So no, it wasn't personal. Just an accident of your birthright." Risman said nothing, unwilling to admit that in his old way of life, Drader wasn't wrong. Risman had been so caught up in just making it into the top 5 students, he hadn't once considered life outside of melee mag there. Meanwhile, Drader had calculated his way into the first seat and set his ambitions on life beyond the academy. The logic was twisted and wicked, but before he'd known any better, he would have applauded it. Apparently, in addition to being irritating and obnoxious, Drader was also incredibly smart and deviously cunning. "I wish you could have seen your face when I called you a deviant," Drader sneered. "I won't lie, I didn't think you were going to lean into it so hard. Admittedly, chasing you out the window wasn't necessary, but what can I say? Bloodlust got the better of me." Risman released a heavy sigh, running a hand through his hair. The hand attached to the arm which had lost its sleeve. He'd forgotten all about it in his shock of seeing Drader, and realizing how ridiculous he appeared in front of his old enemy made him flush. He whipped his hand back and turned a little, so he wasn't facing Drader straight on. Not that it would matter by now. "You still can't be here," Risman said. His feelings were growing complex, and he was too tired to want to sort through them. "Not without permission. Can I trust you not to burn the street down if I'd run inside to change? Then I'll escort you back to the river." Pass." Drader leaned back again, his head lolling. "See, I didn't tell you the whole truth. I'm not only here for you. You just showed up first. I'm actually here to see that sweet, beautiful broad you live with." At first, Risman thought Drader referred to Mazira, and every word of Solarin's request to keep his temper flew right out of his head. But just before he could lunge forward and throttle the mercenary, he caught sight of the dreamy look that had clouded Drader's usually mocking expression. A look he knew too well. "Tiana?" Risman asked, incredulous. "Is that her name? Gods, she's gorgeous! You know, it really isn't fair, you getting all the pretty ladies. What is it? The height? The tragic story?" The hands? Risman asked, raising both of his intact appendages with an arched eyebrow. Ouch! Low below! But Drader grinned. Mercy, he really did have a skewed perspective on friendship. Anyway, yes, her. I think we got off on the wrong foot, and I'm going to reintroduce myself. Risman just gaped at him, his brain needing a moment to reset before he engaged in this idiotic turn of events. He flipped through about a dozen different responses before finally settling on, You're wasting your time. There is no right foot with Tiana. Not for him, anyway. And besides, you're not thinking clearly. She's bewitched you. Yeah, she has, Drader said, and Risman could swear he was drooling. No, really, she's literally bewitched you, he said. It's in her blood, an enchantment that charms you. Trust me, it'll wear off in a few cycles. Drader's expression darkened. What, and then she won't be pretty anymore? No, she will be, Risman cut off with a violent shake of his head. Look, she is pretty, but this feeling you're feeling isn't real. It'll fade. Please don't make a fool of yourself. You'll regret it. Risman would personally make sure he did, since Drader didn't possess an ounce of shame, charmed or not. As if to prove Risman right, Drader's smile turned coy. Ooh, speaking from experience? What'd you do, Riz? And how was it? The longer this conversation went on, the filthier Risman felt. He shuddered, trying not to think too deeply about the implications in Drader's words. What? No, I didn't do anything, But he snapped his mouth shut. He'd almost said, I'm in love with Mazira, but that would have been a disastrous confession to make to Drader, even if Drader had been the one to first call him out on it. Excellent. Then she's all mine. You are drastically missing the point. Blah, blah, Drader said, waving his hook flippantly. She's got witchy blood, but I'll still think she's luscious when it's all over. I don't see a downside to this. Risman raised his hands, sorely tempted to wrap them around Drader's throat and shake him. She will hate you. Trust me, I live with her. She's like a sister to me. Which meant entirely different things to Drader with his broken view of family, but Risman chose to just press on. Nothing will go well for you if you try to talk to Tiana, and if she doesn't kill you, her father will. Her father? Drader frowned. What does her father have to do with anything? Right, broken view of family. Families are different here. Think of him like her overprotective matron. He adores her, and he's a powerful cleric. I've watched him take on dragon turtles and resurrect the dead, which means he can kill you, bring you back, and kill you again. Look, you called me your friend. As your friend, I'm telling you, stay away from Tiana. The words left his mouth, and something clicked in Risman's brain. Oh, gods. Had he really just said that? Had he accepted the label of friendship Drader had thrust upon him? Drader could say what he wanted about strategy. He had still ruined Risman's life and made him miserable for 5 years. Whether or not it was personal didn't matter. There was no version of reality in which Risman would consider Drader a friend. And yet, Drader actually looked thoughtful, like he was considering Risman's advice. You really know her that well? Yes. And he was going to protect her this time, the way he hadn't when he had not warned her to avoid the docks when the mercenaries first arrived. Drader rubbed his chin. Then you can help me. No! Risman tossed up his hands in exasperation. Come on, Drader said. You'll tell me how to behave and I'll do it. I've never felt this way about a woman before. I didn't even know it was possible. That's because you've been enchanted. And may the enchantment never wear off. If Drader hadn't been between Risman and the door, Risman might have gone up to it and smacked his forehead into the jerkwood. Repeatedly. It would have been more effective than trying to talk sense into the mercenary. Better yet, maybe he ought to smash Drader's head into it, and see if he could soften his skull enough to get reason through. But in lieu of any solid objects on hand, and out of respect for Solarin, who had enough to deal with as Mother Lara's new self-proclaimed public relations ambassador, Risman just massaged his temples, begging the shadows for an out. Unfortunately, sometimes the only way out was through. He was going to regret this. He was already regretting it, and he hadn't even said anything yet. But the words were piecing themselves together in his mind, and he could see where they were going. "You're not going to give this up, are you?" he asked. "Nope," said Drader, grinning as though he sensed Risman's resolve crumbling. Why did he ask? There was a really simple solution to this problem. Get Drader arrested. It wouldn't even be hard. All he had to do was casually mention to Solarin that a mercenary had come skulking around, looking for Tiana with decidedly irreverent intentions. Drader would disappear into a dungeon so deep Risman would never have to think about him again. It wouldn't even be undeserved. Yet as Risman held his gaze, all he could see was the black eye and the split lip, and the future he had been ransomed from. Something twisted inside of him, a feeling he decided not to name. Fine. He already hated this, but if Drader wasn't going to go away, he might as well try to use the situation. "I'll help you, but..." He held up a hand to forestall whatever it was Drader was about to say. "There are several non-negotiable conditions you have to agree to, and I'm not promising you anything over bare minimum effort on my behalf." Drader still grinned, and Risman had to admit his delight softened his features. He almost seemed civilized. "What are the conditions?" "First," Risman said, and as he said it, he glanced up the road and tensed. Solarin had appeared at the end of the street, making his way back home from wherever he had been, which meant Risman had precious little time to commit to this course of action. Yet oddly, the appearance of the priest at such a crucial moment only seemed to confirm that the plan he was crafting was the right one. Elistrea help him. Not that she ever had before, barring blessings she had offered to Mazira that he benefited from. "I meant what I said about Mazira back at the tavern," Risman continued, and his tone brooked no argument. "You stay away from her. You don't talk to her, you don't look at her. And if at any point she starts remembering you, and those memories cause her pain, you get back on your mercenary ship and you never leave it again. Or so help me, your body will be the next one they dredge out of that river." Drader's smile faded, and Risman thought that meant he had taken his threat to heart. But when he spoke, all he said was, "She doesn't remember me?" He had the gall to sound wounded. "Trauma leaves all kinds of scars," Risman said, second-guessing his course of action. Solarin had seen them now. All he had to do was let Drader reap the consequences of his own actions. Memory loss is one of them. She's come a long way since we left, and you will not threaten that. Drader didn't understand. It was written all over his face. But rather than spark Risman's ire, the phantom of empathy lurked just beneath his threats. Drader didn't understand because he couldn't understand, because fate hadn't gifted him a little fairy girl to teach him about mercy and kindness. He had no box for trauma because trauma had been his daily bread, his constant norm. It made him pitiable. It made him dangerous. All right, Drader finally conceded. "I won't bother her. I only did it to mess with you anyway, though she is cute." When Risman exhaled, his breath came with a low, throaty growl. "Well, it ends now." "I said all right," Drader said, rolling his eyes. "Honestly, you're so dramatic. What are your other conditions?" "You will do everything exactly as I tell you, no questions asked. And if you don't, this deal is done, and I'll have you arrested." Like, everything in general, or just in regards to... He gestured to the courtyard around them, then sat up, having finally noticed Solaran approaching. Time was running out. Everything I tell you while you're away from those merc friends of yours. Risman waved away Drader's protest before it could properly form. Now, you really want to know how to make a good impression on Tiana? The hungry gleam in Drader's eyes was confirmation enough. Risman swallowed, his mouth going dry. If Tiana ever found out about this conversation, she would probably slit his throat, in the manner of traditional brother-sister relationships among Drow. Hopefully, she'd let him live long enough to explain why he thought this was the best way to protect her, how the more you told a Drow not to do something, the more likely they were to try and do it. At least this way, Drader could be watched, managed even. Don't try to befriend her, Risman said, finalizing his plan. Instead, befriend her father. What? Risman smirked, enjoying Drader's disappointment a little too much. Befriend her father. I told you, they're close. In fact, don't even talk to Tiana for the rest of the 10-day. Not a word. This is starting to sound like a shit deal. Risman shrugged. You want my advice? This is it. Every male Tiana meets falls madly in want of her for at least 3 cycles before the charm wears off. She won't even look at you before then, and honestly, probably not after either. You're a sellsword. That's even less appealing in Lana than it is in Menzo Berenzen. Defiance colored Drader's expression, and he stood. With his feet on the bottom step, he was able to look Risman in the eye. You better not be setting me up for failure, Tyr. What, you don't trust me? Risman asked, with a picture of innocence. I thought we were friends. Is that really a question? Think what you want, Risman said. He'd been watching Solaran's continuous approach out of the corner of his eye. His benefactor had just entered the courtyard, but you have to decide quickly. He turned to receive Solaran, and the suspicion in the priest's gaze made him flinch. Company, Risman? Solaran asked, eyeing Drader distastefully. I hope it was invited. No, Risman said, quite truthfully, but the lie was quick to follow. But not unwelcome. Drader came to apologize for the tavern incident. Risman sensed, rather than saw, the shock rippling through Drader. He didn't blame him. He was still in a state of shock himself. He was actually helping Drader. Granted, his plan was twofold. Really? Solaran said, drawing out the word with evident disbelief. His eyes raked over Risman's missing sleeve, apparently assuming the blame lay at Drader's feet. Okay, new plan. One that didn't involve falsehoods. Risman smiled ruefully, hanging his head with contrition. No, but can we pretend he did? Then shielding his hands from Drader's view with his body, he signed the words, I promise I'll explain everything. Solaran's eyes narrowed, and he studied Risman with meticulous calculation. The scrutiny made Risman uncomfortable, but he didn't look away, and he did his best not to squirm. His motives were pure. He had nothing to hide from Solaran. There was no reason to behave like a scolded child. After a moment, Solaran's expression softened. He wore exhaustion like a mantle, but offered Drader a pleasant smile. Are you hungry, young man? I've just come home for the mid-cycle meal. You're welcome to join us. Risman, why are you dallying out here not preparing lunch for the family? And what happened to your shirt? We have too much to do without adding mending to the list. Risman relaxed, stopping short from releasing an audible sigh. He'd risked his own reprimand, or worse, by defending Drader, and while he was certain he was going to hear about it when he confessed this whole conversation to Solaran later, for now, he was just grateful Solaran trusted him. Drader stepped aside to allow Solaran to pass to the door. Yes, sir. Thank you, sir, he said, and Risman could tell the deference was physically paining him. He actually looked nervous as Risman gestured for him to follow after Solarin, then took up the rear. It was all set in motion now, for better or worse. Drader had been invited inside. With any luck, he would actually follow Risman's advice, and Tiana would be spared his unwanted attention for the rest of the 10-day, long enough for the charm to wear off and for Solarin's prying questions and incessant sermons to drive the mercenary away. And if, by some cruel twist of fate, Drader's interest persisted, well, then Risman could only hope that time spent with a real family, forged by bond over blood, might have some manner of positive effect on the prince-turned-sellsword. After all, but for the gift of a fairy girl who changed his heart, Risman wouldn't have been any different. Thank you for listening to this episode of Forsaken by Shadows, written and produced by me, Sarah Danielle. And thank you to Tabletop Audio and Pixabay for the use of their work in this production. As always, Forsaken by Shadows is unofficial fan content not endorsed by Wizards of the Coast. Temporarily. Golly day, ours are hard.